always thought I knew what I wanted to do and where I was going to go. So, but the good thing is I never, I mean, if something came along that steered me in a different direction, I allowed myself to go there. So, I mean, I went to Tulane, Sophie Newcomb, Tulane University, and I went there because I had thought I was going to be a doctor. So the first 2 years I was in pre-med, and then my parents encouraged me to do my junior year abroad and said, even if you take an extra year of college, go live in another country, learn another language, it's really great that you have this opportunity. And I always was really curious. I mean, Hollywood was such a small place. And I knew I was never coming back to South Florida because it was too small. And even though I had no idea what the world looked like, I just knew, I mean, probably from movies and reading and whatever, I knew that, I was really curious about the world. And so I went and did my junior year abroad in Spain. And that really was pivotal. I mean, because it was during the years of Franco. So who knew years later I'd wind up working for Mickey, whose collection was all about, propaganda and especially, all these authoritarian leaders and regimes that emerged in the, early 20th century. So I lived there for the year. And then my senior year, because of my grades, I was invited to do an honors thesis. And I had a boyfriend in Madrid. And the only way I could go see him and convince my parents to send me was to do an honors thesis in Spanish. So
Nice.
my thesis, it was really weird. It was about looking at, it was like looking how the art, mostly I did like theater and visual art, how it reflected the political and social turbulence during the Spanish Civil War. And I wound up getting, going back for like a month my senior year and doing research on that. Again, very so Wolfsonian without even knowing the word propaganda. But I was looking at like all the magazines and visual culture that was coming out during that time. But so I think the year I was in Spain was when I realized that I wasn't really made for medicine. I mean, I didn't think I had the, I mean, I think I have ADD. I mean, I'm like, I didn't think that I would have the disciplines. And I also have absolutely zero tolerance for witnessing somebody in pain. I
Mm.
mean, I have great tolerance for pain, physical. I mean, not that I'm into pain, but I mean, I mean, I just I mean, I can handle. I mean, I've had, recently I had a new knee replacement and like I took aspirin or Tylenol afterwards. But if I see people suffering and in pain, I mean, I can't, and I have a really hard time dealing with that. So I just realized, and then living the year in Europe, and I took art history courses at the Prado and traveled, and I mean, and then this whole idea of architecture and design really, I like was seeing things. So I thought I'm going to be an architect. I'm not an artist. I mean, I'm good in science, and math and all that stuff and architecture. And my father loved that idea. He thought it was great. He would love, well, first he loved the idea of a daughter being a doctor. And then an architect was like an okay alternative, because I mean he was a builder.
Mm.
So I finished my degree at Tulane with the idea of going to architecture school, and Cornell had a graduate program in architecture that you could do in 3 years, and it was for people who didn't do undergraduate in architecture. So I came back to Miami for the summer and then to apply to architecture, to apply to Cornell, and I wound up meeting somebody here. And so that's why I stayed. I mean, he ultimately left town and I stayed, and probably a mistake I made, but anyway, I mean, in the love respect. But I wound up staying here. And at that time, the University of Miami, I mean, one, I had to get a job. So my very first job was working for Miami-Dade County, which I worked for in an office of the county manager, the then county manager in what was called Citizen Services Department. And it was like it was an ombudsman's office that helps citizens resolve, service complaints and navigate, the bureaucracy of county government. But because we were based in the county manager's office, we were also well, we didn't have like the data collection tools you have today. I mean, we were also tasked with trying to aggregate the information that we were getting in terms of complaints to identify service delivery problems in county government, and then to make recommendations to the county managers of where there could be improvements in either structural, the organization, or the provision of services. So we actually, as a department, it was a really, in our office of the manager, it had a lot of influence. And we wound up, working on things that restructured, permitting and different ways of, running different parts of the county government. I mean, not like major reorganizational things, but I mean, things that were consequential to citizens. So the city, I worked there for about a year and a half, and then the city recruited me, the city of Miami, to start an ombudsman's office for them. So I went to work for the city in like 1976 to start this ombudsman's office for them, the Citizen Response Center, and then wound up just building, doing things from running things for doing, survey centers for the city that would measure citizen satisfaction with government, to then it was during the days of, the CETA or jobs, federal jobs employment programs, and running programs of that. So then I ran cultural programs, and there were the head of public works was running the art and public places program. And even though I didn't know anything about contemporary art, I knew more about what I didn't know than he did. So I like inserted myself and said, I want to do the public art program, and he didn't, it wasn't like he had any interest. So I wound up, being the assistant director of the community development department and worked for the city for 10 years, doing everything from, culture, both, I mean, working on the first film festival, the first book fair. Um, the city didn't really have tons of money to actually have a cultural department, but it gave away a lot of money. The politicians, the city commissioners gave away lots of money. So I wound up managing all the grants and making sure that all these organizations use the money. That's how Bakehouse, and then I worked with neighborhoods on the other side. I worked on the community development part with low and moderate income neighborhoods on, or how they could participate in deciding the future of their neighborhood. So really a lot of when the city was one of the biggest recipients because the population, I mean, the income was so low then. It was one of the poorest cities in America. This is like late 70s. So it got a huge allocation of community development block grant funds. And one of the requirements were that the target areas, and it was all determined by the condition of the neighborhoods as well as the income of the residents, was that the people had to be involved in how the monies were spent. So, George Perez worked for the city at the same exact time. He was doing the affordable and low income housing, section housing, or public housing. And, I was mostly working at the neighborhood grassroots level and trying to understand, what did the people want and how could they be involved in the process. So I did that and then I would, every now and then I'd raise money for the city and produce a cultural event, just do something just for fun. Like, and I mean, at one point I actually raised money in the mid 80s to do, I'm trying to remember what year it was, maybe 1984. It was when right after the Metro Zoo moved from Key Biscayne down south. And I'd, continue to go back to Spain every year. I mean, I've been back to Spain since I lived there the year. I've gone back every year but 1 year.
Wow.
To visit friends and to follow Spain throughout its transition, and just because I made some dear friends there. So a lot of my friends were involved in art there, and especially in theater. And so I went with them once to see a theater performance in the Barcelona Zoo of an actor who inserted himself in the zoo, and he studied mime and he studied what's that Japanese Buto, that sort of very minimalist, slow motion type of dance or performance. And so he set himself up in the zoo to perform the rituals of daily life. It was called Urban Man. And so I went to the zoo and I said, we should do this. I'll raise all the money and, we can do this thing, because nobody was driving down south. And they said yes, they said no, they said yes, they said no. And then finally I raised the money and we did it. And so that, so I would just do either for somebody else or just for fun to just organize stuff. I mean, I think for the what was it, the bicentennial, the Statue of Liberty. I did like something for the city. They had all the tall ships coming. And it was at a time where there was a lot of censorship in Miami because of, I mean, it had to do with a lot of the political stuff that was going on here and what you could say and whether people were afraid to speak about this or that. And so I did like some big thing at City Hall called In Search of Liberty. So it was like this big treasure hunt, and it was really, so I, you know, and then I would help the film festival and the book fair with different events just for fun. But so that's how I met Micky, through friends and through some of the events I did. He would like follow, some of the stuff, and then he kept saying to me, you ought to come work with me. And I'm going, right, like, what do you do? Because he would show up in town once a year. And it wasn't until the mid 80s when he had the first exhibition from his collection at Miami-Dade that he never talked about himself in collecting. And I had even been on trips with him. A group of us would travel together, once a year. We'd go to Mexico. And he would always go looking for stuff. But I had no idea that he had this massive collection in his apartment at Miami-Dade. And so from like 1984 till I finally, he'd say, you should come work for me and, help me with my collection and blah, blah, blah. And I'd laugh and say, but Micky, you're here 1 month a year, And then finally he invited me to his office. I had no idea he even had an office. And it was the most gorgeous office by Jorge Arango, who is one, do you know of him? All right, you could look on. He was a Colombian architect. His wife started a fabulous design store here, Judith Arango, and a foundation called the Arango Design Foundation. But her ex-husband was one of the most brilliant architects in Miami and totally forgotten. And maybe there's 2 or 3 houses that still exist. But he built one commercial space and Micky bought it. And that's where his office was. So it was like a to die for office on Northeast 2nd Avenue and 24th Street, which sadly, if he hadn't sold it, he owned the whole block. Mm. But so he lured me, I didn't even know what I would be doing. He told me he had hired somebody to run to start the museum that he had, he never called it a museum, but that he had hired Peggy Lore to try to figure out what to do with his collection, whether it should stay associated with Miami-Dade College and what would be the future of that. And he had also established the Journal of Decorative and Propaganda Arts. And that was another foundation that somebody who had worked with him a long time, Pamela Johnson, was running. And he, just wanted me to help run. It was like a family office, except he was the only member of the family. And so, he had like people who were managing all of his investments and stuff. And so I helped a lot with, I'd say I managed his real estate portfolio. So I helped him, he had bought the Sterling building, we had to do all the leasing. I had gotten books and books to move there and convince Micky, you don't need the money, but you need a really good tenant. So it was really instinctual rather than knowing that you get an anchor and somebody great and it attracts other tenants. But that was in the days, the only interesting people on Lincoln Road were the Art Center and Micky's Foundlings Club. It was like a private club for women in the 2nd floor of the Sterling building. And, the rents there were like $2 a square foot. And there were like dental offices and like just not tenants that would contribute to the revitalization of Lincoln Road. So as their leases were up, I tried to help him get more interesting tenants and convince Mitchell Kaplan to move to the beach, gave him a sweetheart deal for 20 years. And it took like real convincing to get him to go there. He finally went there and, and then Lincoln, there were a lot of us working on that, but that was like a big fun thing. And then I did a lot of stuff that was peripheral to the Wolfsonian. Micky had to buy another building to move the collection, which is the annex, the annex. Mm-hmm. So I, dealt with the acquisition of that, the rezoning of that so that he could, it was zoned for everything but storage. He could have put a morgue in there and that would have been okay, but putting an art collection was illegal. So I had to like do the whole zoning. So I dealt a lot with his, philanthropic, he was giving away a lot of money. So I dealt with, a lot of that stuff. And then, real estate acquisition, zoning, city relationship stuff. So then the Wolfsonian opened in 1995. And it was obvious that it was much more ambitious than, an individual could sustain. And the collection, I mean, he just kept buying and buying, and, I mean, the building was costing more and more, and the organization needed more and more. And it was like, if you do this on your own as a private institution, I mean, it was because it was such a particular collection, and because the journal was established by then. And then I wound up taking over the journal. The founding editor left in like 1990, and Micky didn't want it to close. And I had suggested you should just close the journal down, and it can reopen. It can reemerge when the Wolfsonian becomes public, because he never wanted the journal to look like it was promoting his collection. But it looked, at the same period, it was a separate foundation to promote the study, the scholarly research around the, material culture, visual culture, 1885 to 1945. But he never wrote anything about his collection. So he was looking to find, like, because he was really interested in learning about what he was collecting, but there wasn't really anybody, I mean, there wasn't anywhere to go, but he would travel around the world, and he'd find really interesting scholars, and they would be starting to write and look at it, but they had no forum and no platform to present the research they were doing, or even to write about it. So he started this foundation to try to track down and publish research, foster research in this period. And so the founding editor, who was brilliant and a really close friend of his, I mean, after that also started in 1986. By 1990, she was like, it was very timelined, what publishing's like. And it came out 4 times a year, and it was international between translations and editing, and it was expensive. I mean, he was spending like over $1 million a year. So when she stepped down, he hired somebody to replace her, who turned out not to work out. And there were 3 issues in various stages of planning. And he said, can you just do this to finish these? I feel like I made a commitment to do these 3 issues. There were guest editors lined up. So I said, okay, but I can learn about the business side of publishing, but I'm not a scholar. So I got those 3 issues done. And then I was doing the real estate stuff and helping with the peripheral stuff, like, the construction contracts for the renovation of the Wolfsonian, or getting the land rights from the other land that Micky owned next door transferred to the Wolfsonian, so they could stay within their, zoning rights or their floor area ratio. So I was doing a lot of that stuff. And then so I was doing the business stuff, the real estate stuff, his philanthropy, helping him. I mean, he made his own decisions, but since he traveled and he was only here once a month, then after the 3rd issue of the journal, I realized I can do this. I understand the business. I just need to find interesting scholars to do the content. And I always thought, Micky's, because I spoke Spanish from living in Spain, and also once I moved back to Miami, I became really interested in, Cuban culture here. So I always just was so curious about why so many people, I mean, all my friends, I had so many Cuban friends who lamented leaving and fantasized about returning to Cuba. So I was really interested, one, in Latin America culturally, because I knew nothing about it and it was so close, and also the language. And so with the journal, I thought, I'm going to focus on Latin America. And so I did, I guess after the 3 that were planned, I found people who could be guest editors for an edition on Argentina, Brazil, Cuba, and Mexico. And so then by then, then the Wolfsonian, Micky, it became unsustainable as an individual thing. We thought we needed an academic partner. We were looking around, we talked to both the University of Miami and FIU. I mean, Mitch Medique was, really interested in it. I mean, it wasn't like he knew exactly what it was, but he intuitively knew it would be important for FIU. And so I negotiated, representing Micky. The founding director left. I was like vice president of his family office and interim director of the Wolfsonian, and then the publisher editor of the journal, and was negotiating the gift agreement with FIU and then helping them lobby it through. So I became the director by accident. I mean, I never pretended to know anything about museums, although I learned a lot from the former director because that was a project, and you know, she was there for like almost 10 years. And so I was just going to be there for a year while FIU looked for, had time to, once we pulled it off within a year, we got the legislature to approve an annual allocation. And then Mitch Medique asked me if I would just stay on, to help integrate it into the university. So anyway, so I stayed there for 1990, we officially became part of FIU in 1997. Wolfsonian opened at the end of 1996. Then I merged the journal into the Wolfsonian, so the two foundations merged. And sadly, the Wolfsonian stopped publishing the journal after I left, which, they published up to the one I planned, the last one, which was on Turkey. But hopefully they'll pick it up again or figure out some way to do it. But anyway, so I'd say, sometimes I think, yeah, so I really had the privilege of, working on something with such a visionary person, because he really had a vision about his collection. And I knew, even though at the time I didn't know anything about it. And I didn't even understand just what it was, what it really meant to be a collector, or just how crazy collectors are. But I knew it was interesting. I knew there was something there that was really interesting, and that it was more than just the aesthetics, it was the ideas behind it. And so, and also I felt like it was like a really big thing for Miami, not only for the university, and I really, believed in his research agenda, but also felt like it was such a great thing to have that here. And since it paralleled the modern development of Florida, everything in it was like the micro and the macro.